Studies say there are less of us every year who can name all 10 commandments. But I'm sure you faithful few know at least a few. And since all the rest seem pretty straightforward for most of us, we're going to stick to this first one, somewhat abstract one today. You probably know the murder one, you know the stealing one, the adultery one, all the material ones. But what's a god? What's an idol? These words are as elusive to me as those hollow men haunting T.S. Eliot's famously abstract poetry. So, a couple of confessions just to get us limbered up for some good old idol talk. Way back when you all were tiny tots, you might have played house or school or war or doctor, but my cousins and I played church. It wasn't a particularly popular game among other children, but we were forceful and loud enough to convince a tiny congregation, in every sense of the word, to follow our childish charisma as we set out to spread our immature gospel all the way across the front yard. I wouldn't say that people flocked to worship with us, but our stuffed animals were silent and subservient enough to fill in those empty seats. Now I, as leader, Natch, had a little Bible, complete with illustrations of ancient white people who looked just like me. And the setup for our little child church wasn't far off from this scene here, except my spikes were a bowl haircut. I had not yet grown any stubble, and our congregation was entirely white, save for the pink, yellow, and blue Care Bears. Now, this church was a North Carolina family operation. My cousins and I met from June to August when I came down from Ohio for the summer, but one September, upon returning home, I decided it was time for some Midwestern church planting. And I tried to get two of my best Ohio pals, Chris and Peter, to play church. Now, Chris was a little white boy, giggly and really, really funny. And Peter was the son of a white mother and a black father, pretty serious and seriously good at tag. We'd been bonded pretty much since preschool, so they were the perfect seed congregation for my evangelical ambitions. Now, Chris was game enough. His parents forced him to go to Presbyterian Sunday school, so he had context and was just bored enough to be interested. But Peter tore down my plan with one move. He opened up my cherished Bible and exclaimed, "Peter?" Holy cow. What was that? Okay. So, getting back to it. Peter, if you can hear me, I'm just telling a story about you. Peter opened up my cherished Bible and exclaimed, "This isn't what Jesus looked like." I, in my falsetto child preacher voice, told him that that was exactly what white Jesus looked like. And then, as only a sharp-as-a-knife 6-year-old can, he said, "That's what your Jesus looks like." And I think our friendship sort of ended that day. I was stubborn and couldn't figure out why he couldn't just go with the flow. Why he couldn't just trust me and let me lead. Why it mattered so much that my Jesus might not look like his Jesus. And time crept by, and our bond just broke. So fast forward to my college days. I had long since abandoned my church game and had basically abandoned theology altogether. The theater was now my church. I was writing plays, trying my shaky hand at satire, camp, basically trying to queer and question everything I'd ever revered. I was equal opportunity offensive. No taboo was safe from my powerful pen. And thinking myself invincibly insightful, I wrote a little satirical play called Technicolor Tragedies, which was meant to skewer basically everything. Sexual relations, theories of disability and queerness, race relations, all packaged in the form of a Greek tragedy updated to take place in a 1950s Joan Crawford melodrama. It had disaster written all over it. Now, there was a black actress at my school whom I adored, Kimberly. And I wrote what I thought was an amazing role for her, a black maid whose character and whose character arc was meant to lead her from subservience to liberation. And I was quite proud of myself. With one theatrical production, I was going to single-handedly teach everyone how to dismantle centuries of oppression. I was ready to take on every hot-button, thorny issue through queer drama. And so we did our first reading in a little room with 50 people watching, every single one of them white, except Kimberly up on the stage and my friend Elijah sitting in the audience. 90 minutes flew by. There were gales of white laughter. There was applause. I was beaming with pride. And when I got done hugging adoring fans, both Kimberly and Elijah were nowhere to be found. So the next day, Elijah called me and asked if I might meet with him and Kimberly to discuss the play. And I was ready. I wanted to discuss that play more than anything in the world. So we met up, and I spent the first quarter of that meal listening to them question the effectiveness of what I was trying to do, suggesting I might be perpetuating racial stereotypes, especially of black women. They suggested that there was a chasm, a valley between the idea of what I thought I was doing and the reality of what I actually was doing. And then they invited me to respond. They were polite. They were inquisitive. It was truly invitational. And I proceeded to tell them exactly what they were missing about my work. I explained the nuances of what I was doing, nuances they apparently didn't understand. And I defended myself against what I perceived to be misguided accusations. They said, "But you wrote a mammy." And I said, "But I wrote a mammy that gets liberated." And they just looked at me. And then they were really quiet. And the meal and the conversation eventually came to an end. And though it happened so gradually that I barely noticed, over the next few years, my friendships with both Kimberly and Elijah just sort of quietly dissolved into nothingness. Now, I could blame all three of these disappearing friendships on childishness and immaturity, but the truth is that these memories reveal something else. I've been an idol worshiper in more than a few ways all my life. I've worshiped my own desire to be the one who has the answers. These memories haunt me in this time when our news feeds are full of debates on white supremacy and patriotism, protest versus pragmatism, making America great again versus making America tell the truth for the first time. When we have mainstream news sources claiming that a white male mass shooter does not fit the profile of a terrorist when he actually exactly and precisely fits the profile of a terrorist. In August, just before the white supremacist uprising in Charlottesville, Virginia, a lot of you were here, and we spent our Sunday morning service naming the first step of our approach to theologically dismantling a white supremacy and the white supremacy within all of our systems. We called it an hour of wrestling with our vision of God, with our illusions of ourselves, and with our collective history. And then a few weeks after that, we moved from the book of Genesis to the Exodus story, pinpointing the times for going in like a bomb and going in like a surgeon. The difference being that we were talking about various ways we might respond to racism when it rears its ugly public head in the news, and how we might work daily and diligently to dismantle the subtle, comfortable ways that white supremacy and privilege infects us in our everyday lives. Now, with questions of patriotism and allegiance being thrown into the debates over taking a knee and taking a stand, with questions of who does and doesn't deserve speedy aids in times of disaster, with questions of what might drive someone to stockpile dozens of weapons in order to cause the most destruction to the most lives possible, I believe a faithful excavation of our tradition's first commandment can guide us. Because I like to think of our 10 commandments, and especially this first one, not simply as commandments. I like to think of them as 10 invitations. When the 10 invitations were brought down from Mount Sinai into the valley below, they were gifted to the recently liberated people of Israel, a tribe who were waiting to hear what might be required from them now that this God had set them free from the bondage of slavery. And what they received was not so much a harsh list of demands to keep them in line, but rather an invitation to join this liberating God in continuing relationship. What follows from there is a list of 9 more invitations meant to extend their relationship with this liberating God to liberating relationship with one another. Now we, as a community in the Christian tradition, have received these 10 invitations, and Jesus, that queer elder of ours, essentially gave us a Cliff's Notes version to further clarify them. When asked about these 10 invitations, he said they all could be condensed into 2 main headings. Love God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. The golden rule, or the golden invitation. The root of this invitation goes all the way back to those 10 statements that pulled those ancient people out of the valley of shadows and nudged them toward a new covenant with God and with one another. Now, in my reflecting over the past few moments and when I failed my friends, when I worshiped my own need to be right, my need to be the leader with the answers, I'm now able to see that I was ignoring an invitation to relationship. I was stuck in a valley of idols, not so much actively, but lazily thinking my own answers, my own experience should be the norm. I broke the commandment, but more importantly, I ignored the invitation into active relationship with those who might transform me. Now we, the faithful, are in the valley of the idols as well. Our flag, our national anthem, our symbols, our commitment to who we want to be are perennially stuck in that in-between valley space that T.S. Eliot describes, between the idea of who we are and the reality of who we are. And this stuckness isn't new. But we have protesting voices insisting and inviting us to new conversations. We have protesting voices inviting us to uncomfortable questions. We have protesting voices inviting us to new relationship. And all we have to do is quiet down for a second and accept the invitations. Now, this is going to be especially difficult for a well-meaning, hardworking, mostly white congregation like ourselves. We are used to having confidence in our own methods, in our own tried and true justice-seeking ways. But I am convinced that now that we're getting more in touch with our history, now that we're noticing more and more of our everyday assumptions, our next step is to accept the invitation to be led outside of our comfort zones, to question the idols we hold up as symbols of unwavering and universal freedom. If we are staying true to the 10 invitations from our tradition, freedom is not unwavering or universal until all feel held by it. A couple of years ago, in a conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement, a black friend basically boiled her thoughts down to one question. What do you have to lose by supporting this? And I am convinced that in symphony with those 10 famous invitations of our faith tradition, this is the best invitation I have ever received. I have nothing to lose by questioning my own idolization of my need to have the answers. I am being invited to follow answers I have never dreamed of. And sorry, there is no ending to this sermon. There is no way to wrap this up. These memories, these reflections spool out into the continuing climb out of the valley of idol idols. I invite you to climb with me. On times your answers seemed the only way, climb. Reflecting on times you've ignored the invitation, climb. When you fear that you do not know what happens next, climb. And it's a long, long climb. But with those protesting voices leading us, you have nothing to lose but the whimpering idols that have always weighed you down. And so as a special prayer to keep this spooling and unspooling going, I want to welcome Michelle Thompson to give some resuscitation to a beautiful poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Paul Robeson. Michelle, will you lead us in a musical prayer?